This is episode 383 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Stephen Roysowich, a retired psychiatrist and independent scholar in comparative literature, investigating the impact of the classics on Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Love's Labour's Lost, Berowne declares, "Let us dance and sport," while in Twelfth Night, Sir Toby Belch exclaims, "Shall we set about some revels?" Shakespeare's plays are filled with movement. More than 100 stage directions across his works call for a dance, making dance not merely entertainment, but a powerful form of expression in the early modern world. This week on That Shakespeare Life, we're taking a closer look at what those dances might have looked like in real life. What was the significance of dancing in the 16th and early 17th centuries? What kinds of dances were popular? And how did they reflect the politics, courtship, and social hierarchies of the day? To help us explore the rhythm and meaning behind Shakespeare's choreography is our guest, historian and dance scholar, Emily Winerock. Emily Winerock is a historian and historical dance scholar who specializes in early modern England. Her research bridges the worlds of movement and history, shedding light on the physical performance of Shakespeare's plays and the cultural context of dancing in his lifetime. Emily is co-founder and co-director of the Shakespearean Dance Project, co-chairs the Early Dance Working Group for the Dance Studios Association, and teaches dance history at Point Park University. Emily has choreographed and performed period dances for historical productions and has published extensively on dance and early modern drama. Learn more about Emily and her work in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get started today, I want to let you know that there's bonus material for this episode available for members on Patreon. When you support That Shakespeare Life as a patron, you get access to our detailed show notes. This week, those details include 16th and 17th century images of people dancing the styles that we mentioned, sheet music that matched to specific historical dances, and even that famous painting that has caused so much dancing controversy about Elizabeth I. You can see that and so much more visuals when you log in as a patron at CassidyCash.com/episode 383 and explore all these extras while you listen to the show. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Emily. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. I am so glad to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm excited to dive into the world of dances, starting with the Galliard. It appears in several Shakespeare's plays. What made it such a popular or recognizable choice for Shakespeare's audience?
Sometimes this sort of Shakespearean period has actually been called the age of the Galliard. It was really the dance of this time period. One of the things that's kind of interesting about the dance, so firstly, so that you have the right image in your head, this is an active aerobic dance. This is the basic step of the Galliard, sometimes known as the syncopes. Hold that thought for later. Involves 4 kicks and then a big jump. And you can make that big jump fancy with something called a caper, a word we still use. That was actually a specific name for a step. So this is an active dance, not a sort of sedate, relaxed, elegant measure. This is an active dance, but it's a dance that could be done by many different people. So sometimes you have it as a male solo dance, even in Galliard competitions. You also find it as a couple dance. You also find it as a group choreography. So I think one of the reasons why the dance was so popular, it was that it's actually very flexible. As long as you can jump and kick and actually do the steps of the Galliard, there are a lot of different configurations. So it made it a very flexible dance for a lot of different uses. Basically, anytime you wanted to show off your dance skills, the Galliard is going to be your go-to dance.
There's a reference in Much Ado About Nothing to a hot and hasty jig. What dance might they be referring to there?
The jig. Unfortunately, we have a lot of references to the jig, but no surviving choreographies. So one of the reasons why we know that the Galliard was 4 kicks and a jump is because there are dance instruction manuals from Italy, from France, from around Europe that describe these steps in pretty detailed breakdowns. Unfortunately, certain dances, more English dances, such as the jig, perhaps we should say British dances, because the jig is associated with the Irish and the Scottish, as well as the English. We just don't know what those steps were because nobody wrote them down. So that is a big frustration. What we do know about the jig is that it could be a dance. It could also be almost like a little story playlet. One of the most sort of famous references to jigs is this afterplay jig. So we think that at least some of the time, if not most of the time, after productions of plays in the Shakespearean theater, they performed a jig. And that seems to have been a kind of theatrical afterpiece that involved dancing, also singing, also some sometimes rather body or off-color jokes. But the actual dancing part remains a mystery, other than we have these associations like that it is hot and hasty, that involves turning, whirling. It does seem to be another athletic dance, but unfortunately, the steps of it remain a mystery.
In Act 2 of Henry V, the Duke of Bourbon says, "They bid us to the English dancing schools and teach la voltas, high and swift courantos, saying our grace is only in our heels, and that we are most lofty runaways." In this dance, La Volta, mentioned in other Shakespeare plays, what exactly is this dance? I read that La Volta might have had a scandalous reputation. Is that accurate about what we know of the history of this dance?
Absolutely. The Volta is the scandal dance of the Renaissance. So most dances of this time period, even when you're dancing with a partner, you are at most holding hands. Maybe you're crossing elbows, but there's very little actual physical contact. And the vast majority of these dances, there are a few sort of dance games that involve a kiss, but by and large, the amount of physical contact in these dances is very minimal compared to, say, later dances like the waltz. So the Volta really stood out to people because it involves a turning jump. So Volta, referring to the root of the word is turn. The male partner would lift the lady into the air while they're both turning. So it requires a fair bit of skill to do. There's also just more physical contact than usual. And compared to the other dances of the time, it was considered quite scandalous for the amount of contact between the partners. But also, I can assure that this is true based on personal experience. When you lift a woman in the air wearing the costumes of the clothing of the day, which involves a lot of skirts, and you turn her at the same time, her skirts fan out, and if there are spectators seated nearby, their view is quite remarkable. So there is only one main source that gives instructions for this dance. And part of the instructions are that with the lady's so with her right hand, she pushes off the shoulder of the gentleman to jump higher in the air. And with her left hand, she is to hold her skirts to her thigh to prevent them from swirling out in a most indecorous fashion. And when I first staged this dance with some wonderful ballerinas, when you lift a ballerina in the air, she does this elegant thing with her hand, which is not pressing her skirts to her thigh. And we had to adjust this for the final performance once we had costumes because it would have been quite scandalous. I would add, though, one of the fun things about this reference to the Volta and to the Coranto from Henry V is that it shows that Shakespeare isn't just randomly name dropping this dance, because he says, teach La Volta's high and swift Corantos, and then we are most lofty runaways. So the loftiness is referring to this lift of the La Volta, and the Coranto is literally the running dance. And so it was a running, skipping, it's sort of less up and down hopping and more of, a running dance. And so I think it's really neat that if you didn't know the details of this dances, you would miss those puns that are being like kind of, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. For those of you who know your courtly continental European dances, this one's for you.
The syncopace, which we alluded to earlier, is mentioned by Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. Now, you said that this might be part of the Galliard, but is it a specific step or variation on that? And how would it have been understood by audiences?
Absolutely. So syncopace is just an anglicization of cinq pas, which literally means 5 steps, which is the nickname for the Galliard basic of 4 kicks and a jump. How exactly the use of that in English versus from the French versus the Italian, we're still a little unsure of, but it seems to be referenced when you want to refer to a basic Galliard, because Galliards could get really fancy with capers and spins and all sorts of impressive athletic feats, but you could also just do the syncopace, you could just do the basic. It's still an aerobic workout. So I would say is that the syncopace is like the basic version of the Galliard. Also, speaking of Galliards, the Volta, even though it has this, fancy turning jump, the music is Volta music and the rhythm is Volta music. So you can think of the Volta as this fancy, scandalous variant of the Galliard, whereas the syncopace is your kind of basic kicks, jumps, get around the floor, do your thing.
When Hamlet refers to the chopine, a high platform, fashionable shoe from Shakespeare's lifetime, and when I say high platform, I mean really very tall. But during his greeting to the players in Act 2, Hamlet is mentioning this here, but is that an allusion to a specific kind of dance that was popular, or how is the chopine factoring into these dances here?
So there was a trend, I believe it started in Venice, of women wearing chopines, these high platform shoes. I think oftentimes they had a wooden base and they could be as tall as a foot. Women of perhaps scandalous reputation started this trend in Venice of wearing the chopines onto the dance floor. So originally they started out as these kind of platform shoes that you would put on for walking around outside in, the muckety streets of Europe. And then you would take them off when you came inside. And especially for things like dances where dancing, they would call them slippers oftentimes. So the shoes worn for dancing were quite delicate, and not just fancy materials, but also softer soles, we think. And so if you're going out to a ball, which incidentally is a term that comes in later. So if you're going to a dance in a hall and there's been, some rain or whatnot, you would be well advised to wear chopines so that you don't get your beautiful dance slippers muddy on your way in. But then we got this trend of wearing the chopines and not taking them off and just being really tall and very noticeable on the dance floor. Now, you might ask, isn't that going to be a bit awkward for dancing? A very valid question. So a couple of years ago, a group of historical dancers decided to try it out. And they made sort of like reconstructions of Chopin's. I don't think they went with the 12 inches. I think maybe more like 4 or 6 inch ones. You know, your basic.
We don't want to break our necks.
Exactly.
That would be
exactly.
good.
You didn't want this to be a very.
We don't want to dance on stilts. Yeah.
They were dancers. They need to be able to dance after this, but they tried out a whole bunch of different Renaissance dances wearing their Chopins, including the Galliard. And they said with a little practice, it was totally doable.
Even the jump, like 4 kicks and a jump in these massive shoes.
Yeah, I wouldn't do multiple capers in the Chopins, perhaps, but even doing your kicks, your small jumps, and absolutely the kind of sort of more the moderate measures, processional dances and things like that, you could absolutely do with a little bit of practice. So the Chopin is not referring to a specific dance or dance step, but more this kind of slightly scandalous Italian trend that once, you know, people saw you could do it, then there were definitely people who were going to try it out on their own dance floors.
In Love's Labour's Lost, there's a witty exchange between Moth and Armado where they're discussing winning a woman's heart with, quote, a French brawl. It feels a little weird because you're like, why would you win a woman's heart by fighting? Moth goes on to call it a jig and says you can, quote, canary to it with your feet, punning off the word brawl. Emily, are these characters butchering the name of a real French dance here that would have been familiar to audiences in Shakespeare's day? And if so, what can you tell us about the dance? How was it performed? And why would it have been used for this comedic moment?
Excellent question. So the French would pronounce the dance branle, that's my poor pronunciation, but it's in French, it's spelled Branle. However, not just Shakespeare, but the English in general seem to have just pronounced it brawl, which made it really, really tempting for puns on fighting when you wanted to sort of layer this, you know, push-pull of love and war. So Shakespeare was definitely not the only one who liked to use brawl as a pun on both a dance and a fight. The whole sort of speech that Moth does is a little perplexing because it's a little bit of, one gets the sense of Shakespeare saying, how many dance words can I stuff into a couple of lines here? I won't deny that some of us have tried to actually dance the dances here, and it does a little bit work other than the fact that we don't know what the jig steps are, so we kind of have to make that one up. The brawl is a set of French dances, but also had been around in England for a long time, since the early Renaissance at least, and they tend to be associated with slowish, not tricky round dances, oftentimes going to the side. So you're step together. When you imagine a simple peasant round dance of some vague historical era in the past, you're probably picturing a brawl. That's pretty much what it is. It's the kind of dance that you could learn in a few moments. You can easily do it all day. You don't need special skills or athletic talent the way you might for the Galliard. You can talk to your neighbor while you do it. But there is an association still that it's French. The Canary is a dance that involves stamping and a little bit sort of some flashier moves. It's a Spanish inflected dance, even though the source that we have it best described in, those are all Italian. So it's like, this is an English reference to a Spanish dance that we, have filtered through an Italian source. That's one of the ones you might actually get a clap of hands. So this speech then combines French dances, Spanish dances, the Scotch, Irish, or English jig in it, all into just a few lines. So I think one of the things that we've sort of tried experimentally is that if you try and do a little bit of all of these dances as you're saying the line, it's pretty hilarious. Because you have to speed it up really fast and you're almost like tripping over, but you can fit in a few dramatic steps. So that might be one way that it can be played, is the sort of impossibility of doing all of these dances at once, because they're not steps, they're actually entire dances. So you'd have to be doing like this sort of mini taster. And so I think that there's that. I think there's also a moment in that Armado is a very, he has a lot of bravado. He's always trying to show off his knowledge. And so Moth, this, young pipsqueak, like he's kind of one-upping Armado a little bit, being like, oh, you think you know dances? Oh, I know dances. And I am a boy actor, so I actually probably do them better than you anyway. And I will demonstrate that for our audience. Thank you very much. Please bow at the end.
It's like the dance version of a rap battle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting, though, that there isn't like a Galliard or a caper in there, because that is oftentimes the dance used for one-upsmanship and competitions and whatnot. But yes, now that hopefully that gives a little sense of both the mystery of this speech, but also the comic potential.
One of the dances that I think we recognize and hear a lot about is called the Morris dance. This is one we're really familiar with in context of Shakespeare's lifetime, and it does show up in a few of Shakespeare's plays. All's Well That Ends Well links it to May Day festivities, while Henry V, it's shouted out in a moment of chaos. And then, Emily, these kind of contrast with each other. Can you walk us through what would a Morris dance have looked like for Shakespeare's lifetime, and why was it so recognizable? And definitely, why was it something audiences would have resonated with when it's shouted out in Henry V, seemingly out of the clear blue?
Oh, if only I could answer the first part of this question. So frustratingly, there are no clear choreographic descriptions of a Morris dance for the late 16th or early 17th century. What we do have is from the very early 20th century, there was a song and dance collector, Cecil Sharp, who went out into the hinterlands of various places in the British Isles and even in the Americas, and collected songs and dances, including Morris dances. And so there is this pretty rich collection of carefully notated and described sources from 1910 circa. It is very unlikely that a 1910 Morris dance was exactly like a 1610 Morris dance. One of the things that we know about the Morris dance is that it actually started out earlier on, late medieval, early Renaissance, as a court performance dance. And that then over the course of, I don't know, maybe the next 100, 150 years, became more of like it sort of went out of fashion at court and then became more of a rural and village dance, but it was still associated with sometimes with street performances. It was a dance oftentimes done by groups of young men. And so whereas most of the dances we've been talking about thus far are social dances, you do them with your friends or sometimes your enemies in a hall at, an event. With Morris dance was a performance dance. You would have a troupe, a group who practiced it, who some of the choreographies, as far as we can tell, were a bit complicated. Think maybe a little bit figure-wise of something like country dances, except that you might be holding kerchiefs, you might be holding swords. And so these dances were performed and you would have audiences. They also tended to be performed at seasonal or even religious festivals. So there were certain times of year, one of which is Whitsuntide. Another is sort of May, like these May festivities, May games. You'd oftentimes a Morris dance. You might also see them in civic occasions like a watch, like a midsummer watch, things like that. So people of all stations of life were very familiar with the Morris dance because even if it wasn't being performed all the time, it tended to be performed in sort of public or like high visibility events. Also, Morris dancers tended to get paid in ale, amongst other things. So sometimes that led to encounters with the law, not necessarily because of the dancing itself, but some of the activities that Morris dancers got up to off of the dance floor could cause chaos and disorder and were not always appreciated by those, especially officials of the events. So I think that that's some of the associations. And then also there's the additional visibility of Morris dance because some of those occasions and also some of the places like churchyards that Morris might be performed in were in this period increasingly contested as performance spaces or performance times. So that also gave it an additional visibility. But when you said Morris dance in a play, people absolutely would know immediately what you were talking about.
There is a painting of Elizabeth I, and I know you and I have spoken about this painting previously, of it bringing a great deal of frustration, but it supposedly, and I'll use that word in air quotes there, depicts the queen dancing one of these courtly dances. But of course, whether that's the substance of the dance or not is hotly contested. Emily, share with us the truth about this painting, and does it really show Elizabeth dancing?
Well, here's something that I can say about this infamous painting. And this painting is actually one of several very similar paintings. The one thing we can say for sure is that this is an attempt at depicting that infamous and scandalous Volta. There is no other dance of the period other than the Volta. And I think it's the Italian Nizzarda that's a little similar. There's so few dances that involve lifting anyone in the air. We definitely know this is a Volta. What is much less likely is that this is a depiction of Queen Elizabeth I. At least I think we can say authoritatively, this is not a sanctioned, permitted, licit depiction of Queen Elizabeth I.
I think what we know of Elizabeth would definitely fall in line with her not having asked to be painted this way.
Yes. Elizabeth managed her image zealously. She was very mindful of the power of images, and she had a definite style in the way that she liked to be depicted. It was static. It was magnificent. She was wearing her not just most ornate, but oftentimes very large garments. Like the gowns that she tended to be depicted in were themselves big sleeves, big ruffs, huge farthingales. She really liked to depict herself, that the clothing was part of the image, and it established this, but it was a static image. There are, as far as I know, no sanctioned pictures of Elizabeth where she's sort of in motion, as opposed to some of the male elites of this period. They sometimes like to have themselves depicted in battle or in, some sort of activity. That does not seem to be something Elizabeth was interested in.
Would she have known about these dances, though? I mean, were these dances strictly for the aristocracy? We've talked about court dances versus the Morris dance, where it was more, a street dance. But were they divided up by class? I mean, would Elizabeth have danced this? And maybe not in the painting, but at all?
So she would know about the Volta. We know that she danced the Galliard. because there are references from ambassadors and other courtiers about her dancing the Galliard, and she was apparently quite good at it. And that's very interesting because that was also the dance that her father, Henry VIII, was known for. And it's also, as I mentioned before, it's the showpiece dance for men. So to me, that it seems a very interesting but logical fit that this queen, who spent a lot of time making sure that people know that she has the heart of the king, even if she has the body of the woman, that she would want to show people that she could do that man's dance just as well. It's hard for me to imagine her ever publicly dancing the Volta, which would require her to have some man holding her. Now, whether or not in the privacy of her own apartments, she wants to dance the Volta, because it's a very fun dance, and it's in the same rhythm as the Galliard. So someone who's good at the Galliard is also going to easily be good at the Volta. Sure, she might, but I just cannot imagine any scene where anyone outside of her most private personal ladies in waiting and, trusted servants would be allowed to see her dependent on some male, however, fond of him she might be in real life. So that's my very strong opinion about this. And it's the frustration is because this painting that has been referred to as Elizabeth and Lord Dudley, that name is probably a really major insult to say, but that painting continues to have legs and continues to influence films and theater performances. And it's like this Volta that just won't die. but the Galliard, if you want to make Elizabeth dance in something that has some historical basis, the Galliard is really the dance you want her to do.
Well, speaking of attitudes about dances and which ones we would want to be seen doing versus ones we would never perform in public, how did religious attitudes of the time, especially with the rise of the Puritan faction, shape how dancing was viewed? Were there particular concerns about gender roles or moral boundaries when it came to who was allowed to dance or how they were allowed to dance?
100%. So one of the things that happens in England is that when the Protestant Reformation comes to England, initially there's a focus, of course, on the liturgy and on the sacraments and, how are we going to think about what happens in the service and so on. But as Protestantism gets a bit more established, you start to see a reconsideration of all sorts of activities outside of church services that had perhaps a moral implication. What most people don't realize is that the really big change for perceptions of dance in the Shakespearean period is not actually about men and women dancing together or dancing in a too scandalous manner or anything like that. It's actually about when and where dance happens. So prior to the Protestant Reformation, it was extremely common for dancing to happen on a Sunday after church services. You go to the church service in the morning or maybe the early afternoon, and once you had been to divine services, then you could have picnics, you could play football, you could have a dance party, you could kind of do recreations. Sunday is a day for reverence and recreation. And this was really important because until really very recently, Sunday for, the Christian world was the only day that was not a work day. Unless you were one of those lucky few who was a lady or gentleman of leisure, working people work Saturday as well as Monday through Friday. So Sunday really is your only day to do fun stuff. So that had been the kind of schedule for fun for a very long time. What happens with the Protestant Reformation is there's a reconsideration of Sunday. It's sometimes called the Sabbatarian question or Sabbatarian issue. And those who were sort of more religious were saying, Sunday is the Lord's day. Should we really be doing things like dancing on the Lord's day? Maybe not. Of course, that was easy for people who could dance any day of the week and who were not working people to suggest. The working people, as you might imagine, did not really appreciate being told that Sunday was no longer to be a day for picnicking, dancing, frolicking, and so on. So this led to a lot of conflict in local communities between those who were saying this dancing is no longer acceptable, and other people saying, who are you to tell us that our Sunday afternoon activities that our parents, grandparents, ancestors, for as long as anyone can remember, have been doing? So you get these tensions around the time of dance, and you get sort of similar issues about dancing in churchyards, right? In the kind of spaces around the church. And if you think about a small village, the churchyard might be one of the main places where you have a big open space. That sort of village green might be more accessible in the churchyard. That's also sometimes where people had markets and like other non-religious activities, ales, all kinds of events. And so all of those non-religious uses of the churchyard came into question. And so what ends up happening is you get courts being the place where people are suing each other over, making these accusations of irreverent dancing in the wrong time and place and so on. And that created records about dance that otherwise we wouldn't even know what people were doing, because if it wasn't a problem, nobody said anything, and those dances are lost to time. There are actually hundreds of church court records about these accusations of dancing and people defending themselves and saying, I saw you through the window and you were dancing on Sunday. And people were saying, well, yes, but why was it the problem? I was in church services. So yes, there were certainly sermons talking about, dancing, it's, the road that leads to hell and damnation. But
cue Kevin Bacon here.
Exactly. Like my dissertation was basically just like Kevin Bacon 400 years earlier.
Exactly.
Nothing changed. Just
Well, this brings up the question, though, of where people were learning to do all these dances. Were there dance teachers available for Shakespeare's lifetime? And for that matter, who was teaching the playing companies? We've mentioned several scenes that happened on stage where these players were performing these dances. Who would have come in and taught the players how to do them?
Who taught you the dances really depended on who you were and where. So there are court dancing masters. Some of them English, some of them coming in from the continent. Dancing masters at that sort of high level, the ones who say went on to write dance instruction manuals, which we are infinitely grateful. They tended to be fairly mobile and moved around from court to court. And so oftentimes how someone might end up in England is if there's a royal marriage, musicians and other sort of instructors might come, like music instructors, dancers, dance choreographers, instructors, and so on. Those might come with the marriage sort of
that wedding entourage,
if you will, for a royal marriage or a very sort of elite marriage. So that was one place. And then those dance instructors at court, we know that they were involved in choreographing for court masks, which Shakespeare's company and other playing companies were involved in. So there was some there's sort of some intersection and cross-fertilization there. In London, there were some dancing schools that were associated with the Inns of Court. So young men who were studying the law, either formally or sort of gentlemen hanging out in London. This is what they told their parents they were doing officially. We know that they did a lot of dance lessons. Sometimes when you would travel, you might go to a dance school and take lessons there. So there's a French dancing master who ends up in Amsterdam, who's, some English folk have come through, ambassadors and part of their entourage. So there's at the highest level, there's a sort of almost like a cross-European dance culture that you can access in major cities and major courts. But we do know a little bit about some folks who were teaching dance. There's one of the musicians who was one of the local waits in Chester, also seems to have taught dance, which we know about from like a very sort of random reference to something else. So sometimes you'll hear someone, mentioned in passing as a dance instructor. Sometimes fencing masters also taught dance. Sometimes music instructors also taught dance. So there was sort of you can say, clusters of skills that a dance instructor might also be another kind of instructor. But most of the records we have are for instructing men. It's a little bit less clear how women were learning dance. It seems like, but at least for elite women, the dance instructor would come to you. And then for elite men, they might go to a dancing school. But certainly if you're just a shepherdess or a milkmaid or, a yeoman farmer, you're probably learning to dance from your friends. Maybe you got to see a traveling players company come through and you really paid attention to those dances and you and your friends try and recreate them. But it seems like
you hung out with some of those Morris dancers at the ale house after their performance.
Or exactly. And the Morris dancers, those are going to be young men from the village. So they will be teaching each other. But when you watch that, you're probably going to be inspired as well if you're inclined to dance. But most of the records just say, not just Shakespeare, but like most of the records in the countryside as well just say there was music and they were dancing. And we just don't know exactly what they were dancing.
Earlier, you mentioned that anyone who could dance the Galliard would have been able to be successful at the Volta because they followed the same rhythms. What kinds of instruments were used to play for these dances? And were the rhythms created to match the dance, or was the dance intended to match the music?
Second part first. So some dances, the music and the dance go hand in hand. There are some brawls actually from a French source called the orchesography, where if you just listen to the music, you'd be like, this music is very odd. Then you hear it with it while doing the dance. You're like, oh, well, that's because you do 3 kicks the first time and then 5 kicks the second time. So they just added 2 more beats to this measure for the 2 extra kicks. It would be odd to try and do any other dance to that music. However, a lot of dances that have more regular rhythms seem to have been kind of similar to how ballads work, where you would have a common tune and you could switch out lyrics to that tune. They're definitely, for example, Galliard music. If you have that Galliard rhythm, you can do a Galliard to it. Someone could play a new Galliard and you would be able to make up a Galliard, improvise it in real time to that music. So it kind of depended a little bit on the style of the dance. And then there were some dances, especially for court performance, where that choreography and that music would have been much more tightly constructed together, I'm guessing. But a lot of the ones you could just play, oh, this is a brawl, we can do a brawl to it. That was the second part of the question. As to instruments, certain instruments are associated with certain sort of social ranks in music in general. And also, so you have differences in sort of rank and status, but you also have differences in venue. So bagpipes are associated with dancing in the north, so in sort of North England and Scotland, but they're also really loud. So they're very good for dances outside, probably a bit much for dancing inside. Similarly, you might, in the south, you might see certain horn or certain wind instruments like shawms being played for especially outdoor processions, because you need an instrument. If your instrumentalists are either leading a procession or at the end of the procession, everyone else needs to be able to hear it to stay in step. So you need a pretty loud instrument. On the other hand, in a hall, you might have an ensemble of lutes. You might have a string consort or a broken consort. So viols, viol da gamba, small, large viols, that would be really common for that sort of maybe a more courtly indoor performance of dances. So you see in pictures of dance settings, you'll see a variety of instruments. But if you pay attention to sort of the status of the dancers and also are they indoors or outdoors, then you can start to kind of see that there are groups of instruments that are associated with those different dance types and also with those different venues.
Many modern productions of Shakespeare's plays either gloss over these dances he references, or sometimes they just omit them entirely because a lot of them are archaic or unfamiliar to today's audience unless you're specifically chasing them down to try and learn them. Do you think that leaving out these dances changes the story that Shakespeare was telling? What are the layers of meaning or cultural nuances that we gain when we understand the dances that were held in his lifetime?
I might be a little biased in my answer here, but the dances in Shakespeare's plays are not gratuitous. They are always there for a reason. Sometimes the reason is about plot. So, for example, when Romeo sees Juliet and is suddenly enamored of her, he sees her dancing. The dancing is what really, that's essential to advancing the plot. Sometimes the dance is a bit more about character development. So in The Winter's Tale, in the dance of shepherds and shepherdesses, the disguised King Polixenes sees Perdita, the lost princess. He sees her dancing and he comments, she seems as something nobler than herself. It's her dancing that foreshadows the discovery that she is the lost princess. There's something about her, sort of the way that she moves, that reveals her nobility and is part of one of the big themes that's being explored in that scene and surrounding scenes about nature versus nurture. Like, the dance is really essential to that part of the character development. Sometimes the dance is just a really efficient and fun way to say, this is a party. Whether it's a big party, like a wedding celebration, or whether it's we just DIY'd this right here and now party, like in Twelfth Night with Sir Toby and Sir Andrew, they just make a party with a little bit of Galliard steps and some music, some singing and a little bit of dancing, and bam, that this is a drunken revel right here. And so if you take out those dances, you're taking out something that is oftentimes a fairly important part of that moment of the play. It's also really a missed opportunity because Shakespeare's text, you've got these words, you can make decisions about whether you want to modernize it or adapt it, but like the text is very present and very sort of in your face. The dances because we don't have choreographic instructions for them the way we do for even stage directions and of course, the dialogue, there's this amazing opportunity to use the dance to transport the audience. So sometimes if you do a historical dance, then that's really a very sort of palatable way to bring your audience back to where you want. But if you have translated your setting to another place, another time, you have this freedom to do a 1950s swing dance, right? That is really going to bring your audience to the time and place that you want. And it's also like dancing doesn't require knowing the language. And so sometimes Shakespeare's language can be difficult, but the dancing can be easily read even by audiences who might struggle with the language, whether that's because of the sort of the archaic language to our modern ears, or because you're doing a performance in another country where most people don't speak that language at all. I think that there have definitely been amazing productions where directors, choreographers have really leaned into that opportunity and said like, hey, we have here in this dance some freedom to transport our audience, to bring that audience with us. There was a really fun, I think maybe a high school production of Pericles that when the Gangnam Style dance was really in, used that in their choreography. As far as I can tell from the YouTube video, that was the audience's favorite moment. That's really what brought them in. And you got the sense that after that, the audience was there. It was the sort of, so sometimes you can be really playful because you have that freedom, because you don't have this absolutely scripted choreography. So I would say that on the one hand, it can be a way to help an audience get to where you want them to go, but it can also be a very playful moment and a little sort of tongue in cheek. And as long as you sort of do it intentionally, then it can be a really powerful artistic choice.
Well, there's so much more to unpack and explore about dances in Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as to discover what we may have been missing in the details of the dances that Shakespeare chooses for his plays. If we're new to this part of history and we want to learn more, what are some of the resources you can suggest we use to start with, to dive in and learn more?
So I'll advertise my own project. I work with a couple of Shakespeare scholars, dance scholars, and we've come together to form the Shakespeare and Dance Project. We have a website. We also organize sometimes workshops, panels at conferences. We will be at the World Shakespeare Congress in Verona, Italy next year doing a seminar. And our website has a few essays, overviews, things like that, but also extensive bibliographies. So that would be my sort of, the Shakespeare and Dance Project website is a really good place to start. And then you can jump off to all sorts of places off of that, regardless. And we really try and be something for everyone. So if you are a high school drama teacher, you will find stuff. If you are a Shakespeare scholar, you will find stuff. If you are a historian, we really try, or an actor, dancer, we try and have resources available for everyone. So that would be my first recommendation. For one of the, 2019, so somewhat recent collections is the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Dance, which is edited by Lindsay McCulloch and Brandon Shaw. That is an amazing scholarly resource that talks about not just historical dance in reference to Shakespeare plays, but also a lot of the really interesting dance adaptations that have been done. So you have your Shakespeare ballets, but also physical theater productions that are very movement based. And also it has a not just Western productions, but really global interest. And so those would be sort of two places to start. And I think the third, there's Anne Day did a really nice introductory lecture on dancing with Shakespeare. And that would be my sort of third recommendation. And I think you'll have all those links in show notes, I imagine, for listeners.
If you're going to learn about the dances from plays like Romeo and Juliet, I can think of no better time or place to do that than in Verona, Italy. So if you are attending the World Shakespeare Congress or you needed another reason to come and check that out, be sure to stop by and see Emily's presentation there. What a treat that will be. I can think that would just be so much fun. And yes, of course, we will place links to these resources as well as the complete list of wonderful sources Emily has shared with us for this topic. There was way more than we had space to include on the audio here. So stay tuned for the show notes URL for this week, and I'll place her entire list of recommended resources there, along with links to the Shakespeare and Dance Project and more on Emily and her work. So you don't want to miss that. Emily, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh my goodness, right. This what a question, what a question. I think I would go for the complete Sherlock Holmes stories. This way I enjoy listening to them. I enjoy reading them. Wonderful escapism, which on a desert island one might need a little bit, but would still, it's still British literature here. So we and I would like to request for that Bible copy, I would like the King James 1611, of course. So I think that would give me a little bit of a sense of a curated library with those 3 volumes.
Because if you're going to be trapped on a deserted island, a curated library is at the top of the list of things that you're going to require. I mean, what else would you need, for sure? Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I am finally, after, we won't say how many years, revisiting my dissertation, which is called Reformation and Revelry, and looks at sort of Puritanism and dance in the Shakespearean period in England, and working on turning that into a book. So sometime between the next 2 and 10 years, look for that from me. And that's what I should be working on.
Emily Winerock, thank you so much for taking the time to share this history of dance with us and taking us on this quick trip through the various dances that Shakespeare would have known about and the ones that show up in his plays, and helping us to bridge that gap and understand his life and his plays that much better. I really appreciate you being here and helping us to understand this part of history.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
With that final step, we curtsy to the end of today's tale and extend our thanks to Emily Winerock for joining us to share the history, elegance, and vitality of early modern dances in Shakespeare's lifetime. Remember that you can find 16th century paintings, woodcuts, and even pictures of those high platform Chopin shoes that we talked about today, all packed into the detailed show notes for patrons of our show. Log in at CassidyCash.com/episode 383 to access those insider extras. If you're not ready to walk away from the dance floor just yet and would like to try out some of these dances for yourself, members of Experience Shakespeare on That Shakespeare Life's Patreon page can download this week's hands-on activity. It walks you through all the steps of learning some of the dances that we talked about in our show today, with a video demonstration, bonus history guide, and step-by-step instructions, so you can learn and practice a real-life 16th century dance just like the ones we talked about today, all at home or in your classroom. To access the kit, just sign up on a regular show notes page at CassidyCash.com/episode 383 and click on Experience Shakespeare. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your steps be sure, your rhythm be noble, and your curiosity lead you to dance with history. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.